Chair now recognizes Dr. Garcia.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman DeSantis, for including me in this important hearing. I'm going to go longer than 5 minutes, and I've received permission to do so. I am the legitimate owner of the Port of Santiago de Cuba and represent the legitimate owners of the Havana Docks Corporation at the Port of Havana. I testified in June of 2015 in front of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on the issue of property rights in Cuba. At that time, I pointed out the obvious, that everything in Cuba is stolen. I warned that American ventures there would involve trafficking in stolen property, in some cases in violation of U.S. law. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened to us. On the monitor, you see the Port of Santiago in 1911 before we purchased the property and received a concession in perpetuity to the waterfront. The port was a muddy riverbank. Here's an aerial shot just 30 years later demonstrating the dramatic modernization and development of the property into a first world enterprise. Likewise, here's the Havana Docks Corporation, founded in 1917 by Sosthenes Bain, an American and founder of ITT. This iconic structure with 6 acres under roof across from the Plaza of San Francisco is the gateway to Old Havana. Unfortunately, our businesses were confiscated, stolen by the Castro military dictatorship. Here you can see, country or death, we will win. Unfortunately, the scene at Havana Docks, however, was more poignant. Here is the late Mr. William Bain, the owner of Havana Docks, as Castro's thugs are stealing his property at gunpoint after demanding Coca-Colas. Today, sadly, most Americans see our property from the American cruise ships that frequent Havana and Santiago as a consequence of Obama's Cuba policy. Here's a picture of my property from the deck of Carnival's Adonia. Likewise, at the San Francisco terminal of Havana Docks. Here's the Adonia docked at my port. To see a cruise ship at Havana Docks, however, just visit Carnival's website, where they use it to sell tickets. It's our unwavering assertion that the U.S. cruise lines are knowingly trafficking in our confiscated properties. They do not have our consent and are in clear violation of U.S. law. Here are the facts and the proof. The prevailing law regarding Cuba sanctions is the Helms-Burton Act. Its objective is to protect American property in Cuba and prohibit trafficking. Trafficking includes any commercial arrangement using or otherwise benefiting from confiscated property, which would apply to the cruise lines. The exception at the bottom you can see is if the use of the confiscated property is necessary to the conduct of the travel. Here's a video of a Doing Business in Cuba conference at Wharton Business School. During a session on cruising Cuba, CNBC's Michelle Caruso Cabrera asked Norwegian Cruise Line CEO Frank Del Rio, a Cuban-American, specifically about the necessity of a port. Let's watch the video.
So you don't need hotel rooms because everybody's on board. You know, what do you, I assume you need a good port?
We need water. Ports are nice, but they're not a necessary condition. I mean, we go to wonderful places around the world that we all have heard of, places like Santorini and Mykonos in the Greek Isles. We go to Portofino in the Italian Riviera. We go to Sorrento, Amalfi, Cannes. None of those places have ports. You anchor and you tender folks in. But look.
So if there's any doubt, Mr. Del Rio is an expert, please contact Norwegian. They paid him more than $32 million in the year that he made that statement. He's not an expert, he's the expert. We took our concerns to the State Department on 3 occasions. The law requires that the visas of all traffickers and their family members be revoked to enter the United States. The state refused to comply with the law, even after seeing that video. They were arrogant, dismissive, and deceitful. So what's the financial impact for the cruise lines to be using our properties? The U.S.-Cuba Trade Council, which is a shill for companies eager to do business with the dictatorship, estimates that in 2017, 2018, and 2019, the cruise lines will gross more than $760 million in passenger receipts. Those passengers will spend more than $80 million at venues operated by the Cuban military, who will receive more than $21 million in port fees, which is money that should be paid to us. On another note, in early 2015, a Chinese firm, China Harbor Engineering Company, a subsidiary of China Communications Construction Company, began improving trafficking in my port property in Santiago. I sent a notice to them in December of 2014 and met with State to get their visas revoked. Again, State refused to comply with the law. Who is CCCC? They're one of the largest construction and dredging companies in the world. In 2011, they were barred from projects receiving World Bank funds due to graft and corruption. They've built huge satellite dishes in Patagonia and Cuba, ostensibly for the Chinese space program. They built the islands in the South China Sea for the Chinese military. These are bad guys. And they're here. In late 2014, they purchased a city block off Brickell here in Miami with plans to build a $1 billion vertical Chinatown exclusively for Chinese nationals. They recently resuscitated a stalled Frank Gehry project in Los Angeles with $300 million. Is this capital flight from China, or is it money laundering? It is outrageous to allow this corrupt group to avail themselves of U.S. law to protect their property and hide criminal activity while allowing them to violate laws that protect my property or your property. The teeth in Helms-Burton regarding property is Title III, which defines civil liability for trafficking. It has two parts: the cause of action, the trafficking, and the right to action, the ability to sue a trafficker. The President could waive either for 6 months initially and then every 6 months thereafter. The right to action has been waived every 6 months, initially to stop trafficking or encourage settlements. And I apologize that the slide is rotated. Foreign countries, however, complained of the territorial overreach. Americans suing foreigners in U.S. courts for trafficking in Cuba. So the waiver was used to preclude retaliation. However, President Clinton, who signed the bill into law, did not waive the cause of action, and that liability for trafficking began and went into effect on November 1st, 1996. At a July 16, 1996 White House press briefing, Deputy National Security Advisor Sandy Berger clarified the President's actions. He will allow Title III to come into force. Liability for those who traffic in or profit from confiscated property in Cuba will arise on November 1st as provided under the law. That liability is not extinguishable. He reiterated throughout the session, liability will continue to accrue. The clock is ticking. The meter is running. It can't be extinguished now or in the future. Moreover, Berger asserted a fact that is lost on everyone today. The President has the authority to, quote, make a judgment about whether that suspension continues in whole or in part, and that he could, quote, continue that suspension with respect to certain countries or certain companies. That is, he could not apply the waiver against U.S. companies or revoke it at any time. Let's get real about the waiver. How is trafficking by an American company in the stolen property of another American necessary to the national interests of the United States? Territorial overreach does not apply to Americans. How does trafficking in stolen property expedite a transition to democracy? 22 years of waivers have proven this is patently false. Mr. Chairman, the fundamental issue in Cuba is a property rights problem. The human rights abuses and violations for which the dictatorship is infamous are simply the measures necessary to defend the unjustifiable, including the theft of property. Trafficking validates this. It is imperative to ask how capitalism will work, much less be transformative, where there is no clear title to property or property rights. How can there be credit or the legal transfer of goods and services? In Cuba, there's no contract sanctity, no independent judiciary or transparent enforcement or regulatory agencies. Americans can't hire Cubans independently. Companies aren't going to Cuba to promote change. They go to make money. Their ventures are only viable while the dictatorship remains. A democratic government will restore clear title and return property to the lawful owners, who will prosecute traffickers. Companies like Carnival aren't going to want change. The dictatorship underwrites their operations and protects them from competition. The dictatorship is their partner. Investment seeks certainty. The notion that economic liberalization will build a middle class that will coerce political reform is ludicrous and unsupported by the facts. Have we forgotten Tiananmen Square already? The business community abandoned those protesters and thousands were slaughtered. The business community would not bite the hand feeding them. The supreme irony here is that protecting our claims may be more important to the burgeoning Cuban entrepreneurs. They're under constant risk of capricious and arbitrary confiscation. Recall what started the Arab Spring, the confiscation of the fruit vendor's cart. His only recourse was self-immolation. This is true in Cuba, too. Our claims are the critical precedent to protect their property as well. Until December 17, 2014, U.S. policy did so. If our policy is to empower Cubans, prove it with actions, not words, about protecting property. The currency and power of American engagement is not our money, mercantilist behavior, or opportunism. It is the rule of law. I will end with how President Trump began the announcement of his Cuba policy on June 16, 2017 in Miami. We will enforce existing law. Well, President Trump, just do it. Titles 3 and 4 are the will of Congress and the will of the people. No decent American, regardless of their feelings toward Cuba, would condone Americans trafficking in the stolen property of other Americans. If the cruise lines aren't trafficking, they have absolutely nothing to fear. President Trump, you too can use your pen and phone, not to subvert the law as Mr. Obama did, but to uphold it. Indeed, the time has come to enforce existing law, Title IV, forego the waiver of Title III for American entities, and end a policy of politically sanctioned and protected organized crime. I apologize for exceeding my time. Thank you very much.